Hello, folks. We're down the line from Cape Cod once again tonight with political analyst, author, and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the Election Eve special of the American Chronicle. We do warmly welcome you to this, the 22nd episode of the American Chronicle, on a night that needs little by way of introduction. It is either the beginning of the end for the incumbent President Donald Trump, or, to put it mildly, the beginning of a period of profound self-examination on the part of the Democrats. As I used to during the halcyon days of Lockdown 1 then, I began tonight's episode by asking James for the feeling on the ground stateside.
So with just over 24 hours to go now until Americans go to the polls, what you've started to see is the two candidates focusing very much upon those key states which they believe are going to be essential to delivering the White House for them. And that appears to have come down to Pennsylvania. Both the president and Joe Biden have been spending an inordinate amount of time in that key Commonwealth here in the United States, desperate to try to claw its Electoral College votes. It was a state which, of course, went narrowly for Donald Trump some 4 years ago. It's exactly the kind of state which many Democrats believe should be a key winnable state for Joe Biden, believing, of course, that Biden, more than Hillary Clinton, would appeal to white working class male voters. And it's exactly that kind of a demographic which Biden is desperate to try to claw back from Donald Trump, not only in Pennsylvania, of course, but in other key swing states across the nation. And it's over the last couple of days, you have really seen the two men trying to crisscross those states in a desperate attempt to sell their final message to the American electorate before they hit the polls come Tuesday. But of course, so many million Americans have already voted. It really is now, quite frankly, a desperate attempt to get those individuals who have yet to go to the polls to vote, if indeed such a rare beast exists.
I note your words this week that there are many parallels between this stage of this electoral process and the same for 4 years ago, 2016, with Hillary, of course. I note that Biden appeared to stop campaigning at some point in this week, somewhat earlier than Donald Trump. Is that as a result of feeling that those early votes coming in were a surefire sign of success, or otherwise?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, you and I, shared experience together of election 2016 for all that brought to the world, and I'm seeing many similar signs, quite frankly, heading into this election. There's similar forecasts across the networks of an apparent Democratic invincibility. Similar signs were said, of course, in 2016. We've seen people suggesting that Joe Biden has a 91% chance of winning the presidency. We saw the same signs, the same figures for Hillary Clinton, up to and including Election Day 4 years ago. We're seeing signs of hemorrhaging by key individuals away from the Republican candidate. We saw that 4 years ago. Even Saturday Night Live this weekend opened with the Joe Biden character played by Jim Carrey, talking very much about. I believe he was saying basically that basically mocking the fact that there's a similar overconfidence in the Biden camp as there was in Hillary Clinton, with Hillary Clinton's character by Kate McKinnon coming in and almost like warning him of the danger of hubris. Of course, she had played Hillary Clinton with a great aplomb some 4 years ago. So if you look at the key battleground states where it is that Joe Biden is looking to win the presidency, you would think he'd be trying to lock these down with greater passion, quite frankly, than he has been doing. Yes, he's been campaigning, basically chasing the president all the way around Pennsylvania. We saw reports coming in this week that he has been trying to head off into other states as well in an attempt to sort of try to sort of win even more of the Electoral College vote than perhaps he might need. And again, this reminding me, unfortunately, of what Hillary did some 4 years ago when she headed off to Arizona to try to, again, chip away into what would perceivably be a red state rather than trying to lock the door on those all-important blue states, which, of course, she ended up losing narrowly in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And the fear clearly is that Biden's going to lose this in a squeaker again. He wasn't out campaigning last Sunday afternoon. His campaign schedule compared to the president's has been lighter. That's not to suggest that Biden isn't campaigning, but one of the great problems is you and I have talked about the optics of American politics. We discussed it quite a lot when we talked about the debates a few weeks ago. Well, the optics continue to play a role in American politics in the last week of this campaign. And of course, you can rightly criticize Donald Trump for holding these mega rallies as he has done around the country, but they make for great imagery and they certainly contrast starkly with those held by Joe Biden, who of course has been engaging social distancing, speaking what it looks like to an empty car park. And the problem is that looks awful on television. And when you contrast it with what Donald Trump's doing, the appearance, even if not necessarily the reality, is that Donald Trump is out there speaking to thousands and thousands of supporters, whilst Joe Biden is speaking to an empty car park. And when you see that on television, it does make for rather stark imagery. Again, at this point, no one can really be sure who has already voted and how these images will play out with those who have yet to vote. But very, very clearly, there is a very different approach to the final week of campaigning by the Biden and Trump campaign, as we've seen carried on, quite frankly, throughout the campaign to date.
We've discussed, obviously, the nature of polls and the manner in which they influence the electorate rather than reflect it. And, of course, we can't be sure the extent to which either campaign is going to be victorious or otherwise in this situation. One thing I've been picking up on this week is the notion that in terms of the disparity between the polls, bias aside, there's this element where certain states you're able to state your preference, state that you're a Republican voter or a Democrat voter in certain key states, and many of those who see the polls going in Donald Trump's way rather than Joe Biden's way are accounting for those where otherwise would be shy Trump voters are the numbers of said Trump voters are being exposed. Your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, 4 years ago, most people looked at the polls and figured, okay, this is clearly going to go one way, and it's going to result in a Trump disaster, quite frankly. And that wasn't just people like me and other political analysts. It was Republicans as well, I think, who until the late hours of election night, quite frankly, still expected Hillary Clinton to win the presidency. It's notable that the amount of people who come out of the woodwork afterwards who seem to be very, very wise after the effect, but had no great sense of Donald Trump's victory beforehand. What you are seeing, I think, as a result of that, is a hesitancy with regards to these polls. Yes, a lot of the polls seem to be suggesting that Joe Biden is going to win, but I think there is a great fear factor, quite frankly, on the left over here, that we could face a very similar situation as we did 4 years ago. Some elections are eminently winnable by parties who somehow managed to snatch a defeat from the jaws of victory. And I think 2012 arguably was one for the Republicans. I think Mitt Romney had a very strong shot at winning that election. I think John Kerry in 2004 likewise could have prevailed against George W. Bush. And this could very, very well be one of those elections. At this point, it could still go either way. I know that there's a lot of polling and a lot of reporting that would seem to suggest that Joe Biden has this in the bag. Well, again, see 2016, quite frankly. there's a phenomenal amount of early voting going on. By some reckoning, at least 70 million votes may have already been cast. We're already approaching the figure that was cast in its entirety some 4 years ago. So we are likely to see a huge spike in turnout, which is something I think we should all be encouraged about, because certainly 4 years ago, despite the personalities involved and the stakes involved, turnout hit a 20-year low. And it was that low turnout which was, certainly in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many people, responsible for Donald Trump's victory and, more importantly, Hillary Clinton's defeat. The Democrats clearly believe that when turnout rises, so do their chances of victory. And certainly when you see, I think, the stakes at play here, and how every state has slightly different regulations with regard to voting regulation, when votes can be counted, even when mail-in ballots can still be accepted by. It would not be surprising, frankly, if that has a knock-on effect into election night for those of us who are going to plan to stay up to consider the results as they come in. That could leave, I think, a sense of disappointment at the end of the evening, if indeed there is not a result.
To what extent is that Democrat faith in larger turnout equaling a Democrat victory grounded in historical precedent, or to what extent is it a more modern development?
I think that the Democrats believe that when people get the chance to vote, they will vote for Democrat. And when there is voter suppression, that tends to favor the Republicans, who they roundly accuse of trying to limit access to the polls. As with all things, there's a degree of truth to this, but also a lot of politics involved. I think the Democratic Party are generally more in favor of a more straightforward access to the polls, perhaps more akin with what we have in the United Kingdom, whereas the Republican Party will stand up and say, well, I think that electoral security is important, and people shouldn't be afraid to provide identification if they want to vote, etc., etc. There is a differing approach, I think, generally to how access to the polls should be treated. And again, you see that variance across the country. The idea, however, that greater turnout will benefit the Democrats is not necessarily always beholden with the truth. And again, the imagery which I always have in mind when this subject comes up is 2004, when following 4 years of George W. Bush, after the 2000 election, which of course the popular vote went to Al Gore, myself and many people figured, well, the Democrats are going to be hopping mad about this. Of course, they're going to be energized to go out to vote. And indeed, on election morning, there were photographs, news camera coverage of long lines outside polling booths. And many people believed, incorrectly obviously, that this represented a huge Democratic turnout that would evict George W. Bush from the White House and result in a Kerry presidency. And of course, the exact opposite had happened. Voter turnout had been the name of the game in 2004, and Karl Rove had got that spot on, quite frankly. So as with all these things, what actually matters is turnout, and how it is that each state apparatus operated by the two parties is able to drive people to the polls. What astonishes me, quite frankly, this late in the game, is that you're still seeing reports about an attempt to drive, if not quite undecided voters, then ambivalent Democrats to the polls. You're not hearing this, it must be said, about Republicans. No one's talking about the need to try to drive ambivalent Republicans to the polls. That there doesn't appear to be an ambivalent Republican in the country, if you will. But there are clearly, apparently, plenty of ambivalent Democrats who may or may not bother voting. And it is astonishing, quite frankly, when you consider what happened 4 years ago, when it is very, very clear that it is exactly that kind of individual who didn't bother to vote for Hillary Clinton for a variety of reasons that resulted in Donald Trump's presidency. And if you extrapolate from that, that perhaps that exact kind of individual has suffered under Donald Trump, been protesting under Donald Trump, and would have most to gain from Donald Trump leaving the White House. The idea that these individuals are still having to be chased, harassed, lobbied in an attempt to get them to vote is quite a remarkable situation, I think.
Mm. Thinking of the old Reagan line that became a poll classic of, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? How might we analyze those individuals, those potential Democrat voters who the Democrat Party feel need to be chased in this hour of history?
Well, it's very difficult in an attempt to take that classic Reagan line, apply it to what might be feared to be ambivalent Democrats, and then understand why it is that they're not bothering to engage in the democratic process. Clearly, and I've revisited this line many times over the past couple of weeks and maybe even years in our conversations. The Republican vote did not leap 4 years ago. The Democratic vote fell by some 5 million. And again, when you consider that Hillary lost those 3 key states by 70,000 votes, it's very clear that decisions are made by people who show up. And the idea that these people are having to be convinced to bother to get out to vote is a remarkable situation. And if I may, this cuts to the very heart of Republican thinking, which is, voting is there, it's a right. If you can't be bothered to vote and you don't vote, well, fair enough, quite frankly. We'll take the votes we can get. The idea that there are people out there who have full access to the electoral process and don't bother voting, which of course in the last election was the majority of people. When you consider that the electoral turnout was under 55, 56%, that means that the majority of people who had access to the polls didn't bother going to vote. That's a remarkable statement and an indictment of the American political system, quite frankly. However, Republicans would say, well, these people have every opportunity to vote. They are expressing their right not to vote. Let them get on with it. The Democratic Party is taking the opposite vote approach, which is, no, we must chase these people down. We must get them out to the polls and get them to participate. So very, very clearly there is a different political perspective with regard to turnout. But again, when you consider the seeming extrapolation between the people who aren't voting and potential financial and economic hardship, there's the suggestion that those who are suffering most under Donald Trump are not chomping at the bit to try to vote, and indeed may even sit the election out. Really speaks, I think, to the sense of disillusionment, which has been crippling American politics for decades, it must be said. This is not a new situation. Turnout hasn't topped 60% in decades, quite frankly. So something clearly has to change within the American political system to try to engender a greater sense of participation amongst its citizenry. But at this point, you really have got to ask, if an election like this, with a candidate as divisive as Donald Trump, is not driving people to the polls, and people are still sitting around thinking, well, it doesn't bother me, it's important to me, then quite frankly, that is exactly why the Republicans think, well, if people like that can't be bothered to vote, then they won't vote, and we're not going to bother chasing it or making life any easier for them to vote.
One of the arguments that I've heard for that complacency is this notion that Hillary won the popular vote 4 years ago, and yet it didn't matter. So there's no point in voting until the Electoral College has been rebuilt, as it were, in a favourable image. Your thoughts on that, please?
So it's funny, isn't it? Losers always complain about the rules and complain, well, if we only lost because the rules were as they were, and if we changed the rules, then we would win. You see this with regards to complaining about the Electoral College. You see it also with regards to the entire electoral process here. Don't forget the presidential election is basically not dissimilar to what we have in the United Kingdom, which is a winner-takes-all approach. There is no proportional representation in the United States any more than there is within the United Kingdom. Well, just like in the United Kingdom, where the smaller parties who can't win under this situation want to change the rules, and I'm looking at you Liberal Democrats out there, so here in the United States, smaller parties who have absolutely no chance of getting a foot in the door at a national level also want to change that. And we're seeing, for example, here in Massachusetts, advertising trying to switch to a preferred voting process where instead of just ticking one box, you would put them in rank preference order. So, tick 1 for Joe Biden, 2 for Donald Trump, and 3, quite frankly, for anybody else. That isn't going to take hold anywhere, quite frankly. The idea that you would need to suddenly change the rules of the game is not something which is chosen by people who have a track record of victory. I was thinking about this over the last couple of weeks, because this idea of people complaining about the Electoral College is not new, and of course it's been going on, and rumblings about it hark back many, many decades. Of course, when Al Gore won the popular vote and lost the presidency in 2000, there were similarly questions asked at that time period. Let me put it within a sporting metaphor. To me, it's a little bit like playing soccer in the United Kingdom, scoring a goal from an offside position, having the goal disallowed, and then complaining about the offside rule. Well, going into the game that the offside rule is there. Admittedly, it seems to keep changing from when I was playing as a kid, but you know what the rule is. And if you try to basically say, well, the rules are screwed to prevent me from scoring, and my goal should have stood, it's like, well, you knew the rules going into the game. You play by the rules of the game as they start, and you can't expect to change the rules halfway through the process. It's a little bit like that with the Electoral College. A lot of people misunderstand it. I know a few weeks ago, over the course of some 2 weeks, we tried to explore it, the origins of it, the rationale for it. But let me reiterate again 2 points, if I can. A, the Electoral College is put in place to make sure that any candidate for the president has to campaign nationally and not simply in a narrow region of the country where they could depend upon their own regional favorability, to try to make sure that a candidate is a national candidate, not a regional candidate. Secondly, this idea that, it should be, population should matter more than Electoral College. Well, of course, that's missing the facts, and I think born out of ignorance, that the Electoral College reflects population exactly. Each state has a different number of electors to the Electoral College, which is equated to how many members of the Senate they have and how many members of the House of Representatives they have. And of course, each state has a number of representatives in the House of Representatives predicated on what? How many people live in the state. So each state has a differing level of oomph, if you will, in the Electoral College, depending on how many people live in that state. That's why California is so very important, because it has 55 Electoral College votes. That's because it has 2 senators and 53 members of the House of Representatives, because it is the state with the largest population. Whereas Rhode Island, for example, has 3 electors to the Electoral College, because it, like California, has 2 senators, but it only has 1 member of the House of Representatives because it has such a tiny population. So the idea that population and the people don't have a say in the Electoral College is missing the exact dynamic about why the Electoral College vote per state is what it is. I think too few people understand that, quite frankly. Very clearly, if America was a true democracy, you would have the popular vote being, carrying the day every day, quite frankly. But very clearly, the Electoral College suggests that America is not a democracy in the truest form of the word. And whether you agree with that, whether you think it is an anachronistic concept, which many people do, I recognize that. But I worry that too few people truly understand why that process is in place. And whilst there are clearly flaws with a process which can allow the popular will of the people to be rejected in favor of this electoral college process, it was put in place and is in place very much to ensure that, as I said, any candidate for the president is a national candidate. And frankly, it must be said, I think, if you look at the electoral college map that emerges after every presidential election, all too often, what you see is a sea of red across the nation for the Republican candidate, and a very scant showing, at least around the country, for the Democratic candidates on the left coast, the West Coast, here on the East Coast, and in key places like New Orleans and Illinois, for example, signifying, I think, that the Electoral College is actually doing what it's meant to do, which is to encourage a national candidate to win. And unfortunately, the problem the Democrats have is that they are increasingly being viewed, I think, by this country as representing a coastal elite, coastal minorities. If you see where the Democratic Party picks up massive support, it is in urban areas, and where they simply cannot penetrate are those rural areas between the Appalachians and the Rockies, and then even within coastal states. As soon as you get out of the cities and into rural areas, you're into deep red territory. Frankly, if it wasn't for the large conurbations in this country, the Democratic Party would be in all kinds of trouble. And so the Electoral College isn't going anywhere anytime soon. We've had this conversation before. The debate is not new. And quite frankly, as long as, what's the old saying, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. The people who win the elections are not then going to change the rules which have ensured their exact victory. That wouldn't happen in the United Kingdom. It wouldn't happen, frankly, in any advanced political system. It sure as hell isn't going to happen here in the United States.
Thinking of the rules of the game there, going back to the Bush-Kerry moment and the Obama-Romney moment, to what extent are political analysts underestimating the significance of the incumbent candidate in any given election?
You see, I recognize where you've got that question from, which is nice. I think you're absolutely right. The power of the incumbency is something which analysts, frankly, always underestimate. If you are the incumbent president of the United States, you have a huge head start heading into any electoral process. You are the president of the United States. You don't need to try to introduce yourself to the American electorate. You don't need to try to emerge from a sea of seemingly regional candidates. I remember back in 1988, there were some 7 Democratic candidates, if I remember correctly, right. All of whom were known collectively as the 7 dwarfs, because they were, dwarf-like compared to, at that point, Vice President George H.W. Bush. And, you get to just think about it. If you are the president, and I've seen people on Twitter this week complaining about this, noting this, and it does make you realize, frankly, how many people are suddenly, claiming to be experts in American political life, and they clearly haven't got a clue, quite frankly, what they're talking about, and they've got no exposure to American political history. People complaining about, it's terrible, Donald Trump is campaigning using Air Force One. It's like, well, It's the president's aircraft. He's not going to suddenly go charter to fly around the country during a campaign sequence. Frankly, I'm not mistaking, of course, the fact that if the president was on an aeroplane, whatever the aeroplane it was, that immediately becomes Air Force One, because that's the designate for any aircraft that the president is flying around on. So the fact that he's got a fancy aircraft with United States of America painted alongside in a livery that dates back to the Kennedy administration is quite frankly a lovely backdrop. But it also, I think, gives you a sense that that this individual, whoever it is, if you are the president and you're campaigning for re-election, yes, you have a track record to run on and to defend if there are problems with that, but you've also got the trappings of office. Whichever president it is, let's take Trump out of this. You will land at a regional airport on Air Force One. You will get whisked to a location on Marine One. You will have a motorcade riding in the Beast. You will speak to any audience from behind what used to be known as the Blue Goose, the podium with the seal of the President of the United States on it. These are trappings of power that your opponent simply cannot have and would love to have. Everybody wants to be campaigning from a position of power. It just happens this time it's Donald Trump. And I think that too few people recognize a simple fact, which is if you are the incumbent president of the United States and you are not challenged within your own party, you will almost certainly win re-election. And as I pointed out on Twitter over the course of the last couple of days, if Donald Trump is not re-elected, he will be the first president of the modern era to go down to defeat, having not been primaried by a candidate from within his own party. If you look back at those candidates seeking a second term in office who have been defeated, they have universally faced an internal challenge from within their own party, which has weakened them, allowing their opponent, be they Democrat or Republican, to steal a march upon them effectively and to secure victory in their own right. So yes, the power of the incumbency is vital. Yes, I think it's been all too often overlooked and ignored by pundits and analysts alike, quite frankly. And it is, I think, one of the key elements in this race, which suggests that anybody counting Donald Trump out at this point is probably making a mistake.
It's election eve and also the House and so forth. In lieu of political predictions, because I know we have a strict and tight rules here on the American Chronicle in that regard, I'd like you to paint a picture for us, please, of the 69 days between the election this week and the inauguration of either Trump or Biden. If Biden wins, what does the United States of America look like for those 69 days? And similarly, if Trump wins, same question.
So the time period between the election in November and the inauguration in January has been referred to in the past as the twilight zone in American political life. It is during this interregnum that any new administration has to start bringing together its new cabinet, for example. But very clearly, we are entering into some very strange times. All across America, cities are being prepared for the fallout from the election. We're seeing governors mobilize the National Guard. We are seeing city centers being boarded up in anticipation of a violent reaction from either the left or the right, quite frankly, depending upon the result of this election. That speaks ill to any aspirations, I think, that Tuesday is going to bring about a sense of healing in the United States. I know that in Europe, there is a sense that, well, if Donald Trump is just defeated, we can somehow go back to as things were before. But quite frankly, the sense of disconnect and disillusionment between the two camps is such that whatever happens on Tuesday, you're going to see, I think, a violent reaction of one sort or another. Quite clearly, if Donald Trump's campaign is victorious and Donald Trump is returned for a second term in office, you're going to see, I think, a sense of profound disappointment, to put it politely, from the left, from minority groups, and that will, I think, result in the kind of reactions that we saw in city centres across the United States, including here in Massachusetts at the beginning of the summer, for example. And likewise, if Donald Trump is defeated, the great concern then is that Donald Trump will not accept that result and will attempt to whip his supporters up into a frenzy, taking direct action potentially against the vote count around the country. The challenge here, of course, is that Donald Trump has a reputation for playing fast and loose with electoral norms. 4 years ago, he refused to just categorically say that he would accept the outcome of this election. He has similarly dallied with that kind of a response this time round. He has announced that he's going to keep holding rallies after Election Day, which is telling whether he wins or loses. Of course, if he wins, I guess there'll be victory rallies. But if he loses and he's still holding rallies, then the great concern there, obviously, is that he will use those rallies in an attempt to whip up public distrust in the electoral process. He has said in the last day or two that he cannot lose if the election is fair, and that if he does lose, it will be because of vote rigging. Now, that is a very dangerous position to take for any elected official, not least of which if that is the President of the United States. We have not been in this situation before. One of the beauties of American democracy is this idea of the peaceful transference of power. We have not in American political history had an incumbent challenging the outcome of an election to a point where he is suggesting that he won't leave office if he's defeated, and suggesting that he can only lose if it's a fraudulent election. Now, what do? We are into an untamed, uncharted territory, effectively, if indeed we end up in that predicament. And if that is indeed the case, then it is going to be a very, very troubling time between Election Day and Inauguration Day, as the world waits to see what it is that Donald Trump and his supporters decides to do in that situation whereby Trump loses the election, but somehow questions the validity of the vote. We've had a chaotic candidacy from Donald Trump in 2016. Many people suggest we've had a chaos president for the last 4 years. Could we end up with an all too chaotic interregnum in the coming 11 weeks or so?
That's it for tonight's American Chronicle, a 12th Peer production 2020 with music by Chris Warner. By way of a plug for our election night adventures, I can inform you here that Dr. James D. Boys and myself will be live on Twitter, video tweeting in a Q&A format the election for the duration of the evening, specifically UK time 2 a.m. to 7 a.m. and Eastern Standard Time 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., the Goldilocks zone, if you will, of all that's fit to print. Until the early hours then, I'm off to get some sleep. Good luck, and ever onward to you all.